looking at critical thinking for solving real world problems. And a bit of a reminder, this is part of our overall 8-part series. So we've covered a number of topics now. And for any of you who did miss earlier sessions, they are available as recordings on our YouTube channel, SRS Recruitment and Employability Experts. For those of you who aren't familiar with how these run, they're about 30 to 40 minute sessions, kind of bite-sized overviews of each of these kind of key areas. And it's intended to give you some tips and techniques that are more specific to being students and graduates. They are interactive sessions, and there's certainly a couple of points during this particular session where you can get involved and post your comments and questions, so please do. And please set the Zoom chat function to all panelists and attendees, because it's just a bit more helpful in terms of everyone being able to see your comments there. And Rachel's going to be on the chat for me this morning, so she'll be monitoring your comments there. So I'm Helen, the University Partnerships Manager for SRS. I've really enjoyed delivering these webinars. I'll be a bit disappointed when they come to an end, but that's for me to write even more, I expect, and to do another series. But in my role, I support students and graduates and work with a lot of universities to help you secure placements and graduate roles. And we do that through webinars like this, workshops, practical exercises and assessment centres. Very sociable, and I do like to hear from people on LinkedIn in particular. I am on Twitter as well, but please do feel free to reach out on LinkedIn and pose any questions or share any feedback. Always great to hear from you on there. Do you want to say hello, Rachel?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm the Operations Manager at SRS. So I look after the day-to-day running of the business and also the delivery of our assessment centre events.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rachel. Okay. So in terms of what we're looking at today, we're going to be looking at a couple of critical thinking and problem-solving models, processes and techniques to develop both. And we always like to focus in particular on how employers are going to be assessing these skills. And we'll close by looking at opportunities to demonstrate and apply your critical thinking. So what is critical thinking? It helps us to manage and understand information in an objective and analytical way. And a critical thinker will observe, listen, and really research the connection between ideas or information. And rather than being affected by past experience or subjective opinions, your subsequent decisions will be rational, they'll be logical, and based on facts that are independent from emotion. And someone once described it to me as being very deliberate thinking rather than automatic thinking. Instead of knee-jerk reactions, you take time and you use lots of resources to distinguish between fact and opinion. Now, when defining what it means to be a critical thinker, we might automatically associate this with problem solving. But rather than being one and the same, critical thinking is an ability in itself that leads to more effective problem solving, and finally onto decision making, where those decisions are based on what is known rather than what is felt. And it is helpful to look at some of the differences between critical thinking and problem solving. And I just wanted to ask you really, are there any particular words that you would use to describe critical thinking, or more specifically to describe problem solving? And if I was to get us started, for me, critical thinking is about identifying a problem, that word identifying, whereas problem solving is more about creating a solution. Have any of you got any other suggestions of words that you would associate with either critical thinking or problem solving? You pop them into the chat for me. Any suggestions, any ideas at all? Systematic application of thoughts and ideas for critical thinking, yeah. Absolutely, like logical process. Analytical versus pragmatic, yeah. So yeah, there are lots of pragmatic approaches to problem solving. We'll look at that a bit later actually. And yes, critical thinking is more about that analysis, more about analysing. Any other suggestions there? Problem solving is a solution, yeah. So it's about creating, generating, solving, yeah. And yet critical thinking could be around creating new ideas. Yes, critical thinking does really complement creative thinking, actually. There's a lot of links between the two of them, something we'll look at as well. Okay. So some good suggestions there, and here are some of the words that I would associate with each of them. So critical thinking is about anticipating problems. It's about analysing, interpreting, making those comparisons and evaluations. Problem solving is more about inventing, refining, developing, improving, and designing those solutions. So just to summarise, to better understand a problem, you need to use critical thinking techniques to help make sense of it. But you need to use problem solving techniques to actually find a solution. And so critical thinking is therefore an integral part of problem solving. And I really like this famous quote from Albert Einstein, because for me, it's indicative of how important critical thinking is to the problem solving process, where he says, if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes defining it and actually 5 minutes solving it. Now, critical thinking is critical to the workplace. As we've already mentioned, critical thinkers are often strong problem solvers whose input can help to shape business strategies and to create those all-important solutions. And by using critical thinking to anticipate problems and resolve issues, employees are going to know what to expect and how to proceed. It's also thought that critical thinkers excel at research, where rather than just relying on existing knowledge, they proactively seek out new information, and they know how to use this to highlight key facts or outcomes. And this is going to mean that workplace discussions are based on the most important and relevant information. And it could also be that critical thinkers are seen to be experts or thought leaders because of how they've collected and assimilated and communicated all of this information. Now, because critical thinkers also analyse not just the how, but why we do things, it means that organisations can move away from those bad habits or processes that are done just because that's the way they've always been done. And this can mean that critical thinkers are also seen to be quite innovative. And it is very much complemented by creative thinking. And when we think about creative thinking, it often means pushing boundaries and taking risks. But when you couple that creativity with critical thinking, that risk is mitigated by having considered all of the information involved. It will mean that processes can be reinvented with a lot more confidence, or people persuaded to try new things because of the evidence that's being collected. So they really work very well together. And critical thinkers, because they consider a variety of information, they can therefore appreciate different perspectives. And this will mean that they work effectively with others as a strong team player, someone who listens and learns from those around them. And your knowledge will also mean that others want to bounce ideas off you. And ultimately, it's going to mean that there's a lot more effective working relationships. And when I spoke to employers and people in general around some of the words that are associated with the best critical thinkers, they came up with things such as clarity, accuracy, relevance, credibility, and significance. And you can associate these words with being a strong leader, but at the very least, employers recognise that critical thinking results in high quality work. Now, there are some processes in place to help with critical thinking, and this is certainly one of the most useful flowcharts that I found, provided by the University of British Columbia. You start by thinking, what do I know about the situation? And as part of that, you might want to reflect on your past experience. You should then ask yourself, how do you know this? Are your sources reliable, or is it based on assumptions? Move on to question what information is important and should be a priority. And you might then want to identify what's missing. Is there something further that would help with your understanding of the situation? What is your plan of action and what next steps will you put in place? And finally, how did you do? Evaluate what you learned, what went well, what could have been better. As we said earlier, critical thinking leads to more effective problem solving, which in itself is very important in both your personal and your professional life. And problem solving is essentially the ability to overcome obstacles and find a solution. And employers certainly value people who can save both time and money by resolving problems for the organisation, or more specifically, for co-workers, clients, suppliers, or partners. Being a strong problem solver means that an employer can trust you with more responsibility. It's also a strong indicator of a lot of other competencies that will be key to any graduate role. So you can assume that a good problem solver is going to be more resilient and not scared of failure. Solving problems requires determination and the focus to see things through. And it also might require you to be creative. And as part of that problem solving process, you'll probably have to work well with others, to brainstorm ideas, to listen, to learn and influence. And the process of problem solving may also demonstrate your logical reasoning in terms of the steps you put in place. So just that one skill is very much indicative of so many other core competencies that an employer is looking for. So we've established that critical thinking helps you to gain the knowledge you need to solve problems, but this knowledge needs to be complemented with a systematic problem solving approach. And there are lots and lots of different models and examples out there with regards to problem solving techniques. And some of the stages will also overlap with what is required as part of critical thinking. And let's have a look at a very basic 4-step problem solving process and some of the individual problem solving styles that you could choose to apply. Firstly, you need to define the problem. As part of this, you want to identify the root causes and understand the target or objective you need to achieve. And this will involve a practical approach where you review the facts. You then want to generate ideas and solutions, and you could do this by brainstorming ideas with others. It's worth mentioning at this point that if you don't have the luxury of time or you don't have a lot of information, you might have to apply more of an intuitive approach to solving the problem. And this is quite, in opposition to critical thinking, because it might be where you have to rely on your instincts and your experience instead of well-researched facts. But I did just want to acknowledge the fact that that can happen. You do have to sometimes make decisions and come up with solutions on the spot. You then need to evaluate your solutions, and it might be that you use a more logical approach to decide what solution is feasible and what you require to make it work. And finally, you need to implement your solution. And this might be where you apply a more social sensitive approach, thinking about the wider good and what will be the best solution for everyone involved. Now, you can certainly go into a lot more detail about the problem solving process, and I'd definitely encourage you to explore this further. At the moment, we're going to now look at how you can apply some of the approaches we've mentioned to real world challenges and trends and how it's relevant. So rather than just being focused on the job at hand, there is an increasing need to think globally and be seen as an empathetic, driven and engaged citizen. It's great if you can show an employer how you can see beyond yourself and your subject area to those wider trends and challenges that ultimately shape the creation and development of future graduate jobs. Your role might require you to critically think about how you can support sustainable development or resolve problems for your organisation that arise from global issues, such as the pandemic. And aside from the pandemic, what do you think are some of the biggest global trends and challenges at the moment? Has anyone got any suggestions of what some of those big global issues, some of those hot topics are that are affecting organisations across the world? Climate change, absolutely, very much. Brexit, yes. Overall economy, yeah, fantastic. Any others there? Unemployment, yeah. Think about some of the innovations that have happened recently as well. COVID, yeah, the pandemic. Waste, yeah. Resource scarcity, definitely. Mental health, yeah. Travel back, yeah. Some great suggestions there. Digital transformations, yes, definitely, definitely. Food poverty. I love that last one, inequalities around the race, gender, health, yes, fantastic. Okay. And to pull some of these out, so all of those suggestions you made, there are indeed mega trends, issues and hot topics that are impacting on organisations across the world. PricewaterhouseCoopers more specifically identified 5 global shifts, or what they call mega trends, that are set to reshape the world we live in. And I think a lot of what you said there can be broadly grouped under these 5 areas. So you've got rapid urbanisation, climate change and resource scarcity, so thinking about that food poverty, the shift in global economic power, so some of those inequalities, demographic and social change, and technological breakthroughs. And let's have a look at each of these in turn. So currently more than half the global population live in urban areas, with this being increased by 1.5 million people every week. And this will affect organisations in terms of how they step up to take more responsibility for service delivery, for infrastructure and job creation. A flexible, innovative and collaborative workforce is needed to think critically about growth opportunities and how to operate in new markets. Secondly, an increasingly urbanised world will accelerate climate change and cause irreversible damage to the environment. And there's a lot more pressure on organisations to get involved with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and a need to demonstrate strong environmental, social and governance attributes. And by focusing on these 3 areas, businesses are actually outperforming the market and having that much bigger positive profile. Therefore, within your career, you'll probably be required to think about how your business or how your particular role can help the environment, rather than just being focused on financial results and short-term gains. The third megatrend identified by PwC is the shift in global economic power, where some emerging economies such as Brazil and Russia are now in decline. And one of the reasons for this is the drop in prices for things such as oil. And what it means for you in working within a business is it might be that you're in an industry or an organisation that's that bit more volatile, and you'll need to use critical thinking to review prospects and assess risks. PwC's research also confirms that the pace of demographic and social change will pose significant challenges to organisations. So, for example, the world's population is projected to rise by more than 1 billion by 2030, and people are having fewer children and living longer, therefore resulting in an ageing population. So we need to create and prepare for a more diverse workforce now rather than later. And much thought needs to be given to how we fully leverage the talent of this workforce with new ways of working and those opportunities for lifelong learning and skills development. Finally, PwC highlights the importance of technological breakthroughs such as artificial intelligence, smart devices, and augmented reality. And these are not just changing business, but also how we behave and how we communicate. And as discussed earlier, critical thinking complements creative thinking, both of which are needed to generate and understand innovations in this area. Now, although you probably won't be asked to create something like a new sustainability strategy for your business at the start of your career, be prepared to think critically and contribute even on a small level to some of these key areas that will shape the future of the organisation that you join. Are there focus groups you can join, perhaps looking at the diversity of the workforce? Can you attend industry events, review relevant publications, or join communities and groups that are perhaps geared at getting employees more involved with the environment? Shadow other leaders and critical thinkers within the organisation to understand existing approaches, and experiment with different technology, ask lots of questions. Ultimately, you need to start as you mean to go on by collecting and assessing information. The more you do this, the more you'll be able to contribute and be seen as that critical thinker. But before you get hired, you need to be able to demonstrate critical thinking and problem solving in the recruitment process. And this is being assessed by employers in a number of ways, sometimes directly and sometimes more indirectly. And some of these could include psychometric tests, probably more a direct way of assessing critical reasoning. And it may happen at the start of the recruitment process, but these tests can also be repeated later on. And we have actually written a separate webinar on psychometric tests, which is on our YouTube channel, so feel free to delve into that. Critical thinking might also be tested by game-based exercises, e-trade tasks or group assessments that are job specific and require you to devise a solution to a typical problem. And these types of exercises may also test to see if you spot potential problems and how you respond to them. And if we use a group exercise as an example, you'll be given information to review from which there'll be a problem to resolve or an objective to achieve. And you're likely to be measured on how you analyse this information, whether or not your reasoning makes sense, and whether you listen to others to gain different perspectives, all valuable parts of critical thinking. They may also be assessing you on the types of questions you ask. And let's go on to look at this particular point in a bit of a practice scenario. So I want you to imagine that you work for an organisation that was due to run an event next month, and your colleague has just informed you that you no longer have the funding to do this. Now let's assume that you have some context around what the organisation is and what the event is. And so thinking beyond those points, what questions would you ask as part of critical thinking? What further information would you require? I was just hoping you could post some suggested questions in the chat there. So thinking about, you've just been told that event's been cancelled. What would you want to know at this point? What is the budget? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Can you still go ahead on a smaller budget? Can you adapt it? Any other questions there? What is the reason? Yes. Why has it been cancelled? Yeah. It's external factors. Is it a mistake that it's been cancelled? Any other questions there? Can the event be done in a different way? Yes. Starting to think of those solutions. Absolutely. Could it be rescheduled if we raise the funds? Yeah. Yeah, so looking at other options, can it be run digitally? Can it be run in-house? What are the options to find ways to get funding? Yes. Yeah, looking at other areas, other resources. What is the impact of cancelling? I love that one. Yes, absolutely. So you might be able to persuade people that the consequences of cancelling it, are so bad in terms of the impact it has on perhaps profit or profile, and you might be able to persuade people to still go ahead with it. Great questions. Could we find volunteers? Yeah. Who can be involved to help us with the issue? Love that. Who question. Very good. Okay. So just to bring up some of the questions that I would apply to this particular situation as well, some of which you've already mentioned. I would start with that one on the far left at the top. Where did your colleague get this information from? Verify that it's correct, that it's not a miscommunication, because yeah, it's sometimes things get lost in translation. Where did the funds come from? And that was one of the questions that came up in the chat there. Is there a particular department struggling or a specific budget that has been cut? Who has made this decision, or who are the key stakeholders that are involved? Have these people withdrawn funds without seeing the bigger picture? Have they made a mistake? Why is there a lack of funding? And that again came up in the chat there. Perhaps you can identify if the funds have been reallocated and why, or if there's been some external factors that have affected it. What are the consequences of not running this event? Yeah, brilliant, someone mentioned that. How can you demonstrate that to others? When can we expect this to change? Or when should we ask for help? Are there other budgets or people who could support with this? how can we increase funding? So it's starting to think about those solutions or how you can adapt the event. Now, whenever you discuss or discover new information, ask questions that centre on the where, the who, the why, the what, the how, and when. They're questions that will help you to ascertain the facts, establish what's missing and what's important. So some great questions that came through from you there. Now, in terms of how these skills will be assessed in interviews, you might be asked hypothetical questions around how you would respond to particular problems, or to give examples of when you've demonstrated these skills. So some examples could be as obvious as, tell me about a time when you've had to deal with a difficult problem, or give an example of when you faced an unexpected challenge and did not have all the necessary information. Alternatively, there might be job-specific questions that ask things such as, what would you do if there was a delay to a customer order? Or how would you deal with conflict in the workplace? So it's not as obvious that it's asking you about critical thinking, but it's very much requiring you to elaborate on the steps that you took to resolve that situation, which for me is how you used critical thinking. Now, for all of those types of questions, you should use the STARR technique, whether it's providing examples from your experience or describing the steps you would take in a hypothetical situation. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on the STARR technique. It comes up in a lot of our webinars, but as a reminder, it's about using a framework to structure your answers, where S is for describing the situation, providing context. T is for outlining the particular task or problem you're dealing with. A is for the specific actions and steps you took, and R is for the overall result or outcome. And we like to add on an additional R at SRS for reflection. You know, what did you learn about your approach? What would you do differently next time? And when thinking of your examples of critical thinking or problem solving, it doesn't necessarily matter how big the problem is. You know, it doesn't, if you haven't got an example that's from your work, that's a big project or a big crisis, you know, it doesn't matter. You may be able to give examples of when you've dealt with a complaint or organised a trip. What matters most is that you show how you approach the problem and how you came to the solution. Now, we wanted to give you some practical examples of how you can develop these skills. And one of the best ways of doing this is by playing games. You know, how many times have you played your favourite game and got stuck on the same level for hours before you finally find a way around it? Now, whether that's online or board games, this will really sharpen your skills in problem solving and critical thinking. You should also enter debates and discussions where you ask questions and compare what you know with others. Pick essay topics and assignments that will challenge you to research new areas and come up with solutions. And a lot of universities run competitions or simulate business challenges that you can really put your mind to. And make a point of seeking out opposing opinions to your own as part of these essays or projects. Attend courses or read some further resources in this area. There's some great literature about this out there. And this will give you even more practical models to refer to, in addition to the ones that I used in this webinar. And finally, practice. Take any opportunity you can to practice these skills, even if it means simply questioning your family and friends more, when before you might just have accepted their viewpoint as being correct. And in terms of overall top tips, what I'd really want to drum home with you is be curious. You know, so conduct thorough investigations, ask why and how all the time, because this is going to help you to identify the key information and the root causes of problems. Analyze in parts, break information and problems down into manageable steps that you tackle in turn. Be objective and detach yourself from the problem. So don't believe things just because others do, or you've seen it in the news, and I'm sure you've all seen plenty of examples of fake news out there. Instead, you should challenge yourself to evaluate information and think critically. And another quote for you here from Richard Branson from the Virgin Group. Learn to use your brain power. critical thinking is the key to creative problem solving in business. It kind of sums up in a nutshell what we've been talking about. And I also like to close with a couple of things to think about going forwards that will help to develop your critical thinking. You know, think about something you know well, where you perhaps take that knowledge for granted. How do you know about it? Is it from reading social media or watching others? Or did you actually research the topic? Secondly, perhaps you have a strong opinion on something, but really take time to consider the alternative and a different way of looking at it. So that brings us to the end of the webinar. I'm happy to take any questions you have at this point. Anything you'd like to raise?
Helen, could you expand on how would you answer any example type questions if you don't have the necessary extracurricular work experience to draw from?
You'll always have experience to draw from. And I think this is something I find with quite a few students and graduates I've personally interviewed, is that they assume that if they haven't got work experience or a major achievement, that they don't have examples. But you must have done things, even in your home, where you've had to work on an assignment to a tight deadline. Your family asked you to do something and didn't give you all the information. You organised an outing with friends, and there was lots of different things to consider as part of that. We had one example. It was an assessor who actually shared this with me, so it wasn't me personally that was in this interview. But there was a candidate who talked about how they'd helped plan their sister's wedding. So, you know, they weren't an official wedding planner, they weren't working as such, but, you know, they just talked about how they gathered all the information, assessed what their sister was looking for and how they pulled it all together. So, yes, it's useful to have work experience examples, and they're probably more of the obvious ones, but that doesn't mean that you don't have experience that you can share. It's all about how you sell it, how you structure it, to best answer that question. So hopefully that gives you a bit of food for thought there. Have we got any other questions there? That was a good question. You can always ask if anyone puts you on the spot in interviews as well. And I've mentioned this before. If someone asks you a question which stumps you, you can ask for a moment to think about it. I know it can feel like a bit of an uncomfortable silence, but I've certainly done that in interviews I've had. I got asked in an interview once, when have I taken a risk and what did I learn from it? And a response didn't immediately come to mind. So I just wanted a moment to think about it, to think about the best thing that I could use to answer that question and to come back to it. Yeah. You're very quiet there, keeping me, giving me a nice easy ride by not asking too many questions. If any of you would be more comfortable posing questions to me on LinkedIn, please do. But I hope you found the webinar useful. It's quite an interesting subject. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. Hope it's been good, and it will take you to a survey at the end as well, as usual. Please give a particular comment if you found this particular subject area good, or a comment if you want us to cover any future topics. That'd be great. Thank you very much.